The vertebrate body is filled with cavities. The cavities are open areas within the body that are going to house the internal viscera, the internal organs. Now, when we talk about the body cavities, these are separations of spaces. And that's really important in a physiological standpoint because it allows things to happen here that don't necessarily happen here. It keeps things isolated, it compartmentalizes the body. And there are 4 or 5 different cavities that we talk about depending on how you break them up or how you subdivide them. So the first cavity that we talk about is something known as the dorsal cavity along the dorsal wall. This is going to be the cranial cavity, which is going to house the brain, and then the vertebral cavity, which runs through the vertebral canal, which is going to house the spinal cord. So the dorsal cavity broken up into the cranial cavity and then the vertebral cavity. Now, then you have the ventral cavity, which is basically all of this open stuff and all of these cavities. The big one here is the thoracic cavity, your chest cavity. So if they say in a medical show, we need to crack the chest, they're really just opening up that thoracic cavity. In the thoracic cavity, this cavity here is separated from the abdominopelvic cavity, this cavity down here, by this muscular structure known as the diaphragm. It's a muscular wall that is involved in respiration, but that physically separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. So if we start up here, the thoracic cavity, your chest cavity, subdivided into multiple smaller compartments. You have the pleural cavity, which houses the lungs. So you have a right pleural cavity, you have a left pleural cavity. And then the space in between them, so you have a cavity here, you have a cavity over here, right? That's going to be the space in between is the mediastinum. So this is your mediastinum here. So here you have the superior mediastinum, here you have the inferior mediastinum. Now, situated within that space, so it's not really a true cavity, it's more of an open space. Situated within there is a true cavity known as the pericardial cavity. And the pericardial cavity is going to house the heart. So this is your heart cavity here. Now, the diaphragm, that muscular wall, separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity is the lower or the inferior body cavity, and it's going to house organs of the digestive tract, the digestive system, the urinary system, and the reproductive system. Now, some people will further divide the abdominopelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity, where a majority of the digestive content and structures are, and then the pelvic cavity, which is where contents or organs of the urinary system are. Now, there's not really a physical separation between these two cavities, not physically separated. So, because of that, we refer to them collectively as the abdominopelvic cavity. Sometimes it's just easier for frame of reference to divide those two into different cavities, but they're not physically separated. Which brings us to a very interesting point. If we look at non-mammalian vertebrates, non-mammalian vertebrates do not have a diaphragm. So if we look at this frog dissection here, this illustration of the frog, these are the lungs here. This is the digestive tract down here. You got the stomach, right? And then you're going to have the urinary bladder here. This is all one big cavity. So where the heart is, right there, that's going to be your heart. We can look over here. Here's the heart. Here are the lungs, right? This is the digestive system, right? There's all within one big cavity. They don't have a separation between the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity because they lack that diaphragm. So because of that, they do not have a true thoracic cavity and they don't have a true abdominopelvic cavity. They have one big cavity. That one big cavity is known as the coelom or the coelomic cavity, right? Because we are, as vertebrates, coelomates. We have this open cavity within us, right? So that is the coelom. And so because of that, it would be erroneous to say the abdominal cavity of a frog. It's the coelomic cavity of the frog. So that's an interesting point, right? But we can take a look, and here we can see our thoracic cavity. That's going to be basically deep to the sternum, and we see that diaphragm that's going to separate that thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity down here. And we can see within that thoracic cavity, this is the mediastinum. This is a lateral view of that, right? So this is going to be anterior up here. This is posterior back here. Here you see the anterior mediastinum. Back here you see the posterior mediastinum. And then here is the superior mediastinum. And within that, you can see basically the pericardial cavity. Then below the diaphragm, or inferior to the diaphragm, remember to use your anatomical terms, inferior to diaphragm is that abdominopelvic cavity. So here's our abdominopelvic cavity, and that's separated into the abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity by this arbitrary line, which we call the linea terminalis, right? But it's not a physical separation from them. Okay, and then we can see here's our dorsal cavity, which is comprised of the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. And we can see that sort of divided up over here where we see the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. And we can see that vertebral cavity is situated within the vertebral canal within the spinal cord, that there. Okay, now these cavities are very important and they are surrounded by some membranes and tissues called serous membranes, which we're going to talk about in the next video.